Astral, Psychic, and Spiritual Man articles by H.P. Blavatsky. Animated statues. Chinese spirits. Nature's human magnets. A psychic warning. Theosophy and spiritualism. An astral prophet. Memory in the dying age. P. Blavatsky Series No. 4. Theosophy Company, Mysore, Private Ltd. Bangalore 560-004. Objects of the Theosophical movement. I. To form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. 2. The study of ancient and modern religions, philosophies, and sciences, and the demonstration of the importance of such study. And 3. The investigation of the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. SI law RSATLRR.IRTTTI equals ZSTT.1 is RRRR1. The Articles of H. P. Blavatsky and W. Q. Judge, which originally appeared in the Theosophist, Lucifer, and the Path, were issued in pamphlet form by THF Theosophy Company, Los Angeles, USA. For the benefit of students and inquirers in India, these are now being reprinted in an Indian edition. IIIIIIIIIIS reprint edition, 1981 La SBIJL. R. Li by courtesy, The Theosophy Company, 245, West 33rd St., Los Angeles, California, 90007 USA. Printed by V. N.I.R. at Commercial Printing House, 41/1, 3rd Main Road, Gandhinagar, Bangalore 560-009, and published by J. M. Tijkriwala for Theosophy Company, Mysore, Private Limited, 4, Sir Krishna Rao Road, Basavangudi, Bangalore 560-004. Forward. The articles here reprinted all give evidence of the importance of the theosophical teaching of man's 7 principles, especially the middle principles through which alone light can be thrown on the strange psychical phenomena which so puzzle and confuse the Western world. Animated statues, which appeared in the Theosophist for November, 1886, deals with matters regarded as pure superstition by modern scholars. Few readers in our time are aware of the extent to which speaking images were known to the writers of antiquity. In gathering this testimony, and giving as much explanation as seemed appropriate, HPB leads the reader through a maze of classical sources and authorities, offering occult commentary along the way, and defending pagan antiquity and its grand philosophy. She is under the double necessity of vindicating certain ancient philosophies while refuting Roman Catholic writers who accepted the phenomena but attributed it to demons. Yet the reality of sorcery and black magic has attention, since indifference to such possibilities may bring tragic results to those of a sensitive nature. 5 crucial questions and distinctions, illustrating the perspective of the occultist, are presented at the end of this article, which is in part a notice of F. Anstey's novel, The Fallen Idol. Anstey, Thomas Anstey Guthrie, had treated humorously matters that deserved, she said, more serious recognition. Chinese Spirits, posthumously published in Lucifer for November, 1891, shows from the testimony of HPB's learned Chinese informant that old temple teachings in China were well informed concerning the principles of man's nature. The Chinese names of the principles are given and explained in terms of their theosophical equivalents. Here, again, in correction of the reports and misrepresentations of Catholic missionaries, HPB renders the meaning of the Chinese traditions according to occult philosophy. In Nature's Human Magnets, which appeared in the Theosophist for April, 1881, HPB discusses reports of magnetic phenomena produced in the presence of peculiarly endowed individuals, using the researches of Baron von Reichenbach to show that magnetism is a compound instead of a simple force. The point of her explanation is that these strange happenings were not supernatural, but simply expressions of unknown laws of nature. The mutual psychic influence existing between individuals joined by strong affinities is the subject of a psychic warning. H.P.B.'s long comment on a communication from a reader, printed in the Theosophist for June, 1881. The power of the last thought of a dying man to affect the decisions and behavior of one who has been close to him is illustrated and discussed. Replying to a correspondent in the Theosophist for August, 1882, under the title, Theosophy and Spiritualism, HPB distinguishes clearly between the two, at the same time showing friendly hospitality to spiritualists who are interested in theosophic conceptions. The reality of communications from the higher ego is the content of an astral prophet, in which HPB comments on the extraordinary experience of a Russian general who died in 1861. This article appeared in Lucifer for June, 1890. There has been much discussion during the later years of the 20th century of the feelings and states of mind of the dying. This subject would be greatly illuminated by investigation of the theosophic teachings concerning death, which deal with the extraordinary transition experienced by the ego. At the time of death, for a few seconds at least, HPB says at the close of memory in the dying, are two memories, or rather the two states, the highest and the lowest state, of consciousness, blend together, thus forming one, with the result that the dying being finds himself on a plane wherein there is neither past nor future, but all is one. Memory in the Dying was published in Lucifer for October, 1889. Theosophist, November, 1886. Animated statues. To whatsoever cause it may be do matters little, but the word fetish is given in the dictionaries the restricted sense of an object selects temporarily for worship, a small idol used by the African savages, etc., etc. In his De Cults and Terrors à l'Idolatrie, Theolor defines fetishism as the adoration of an object considered by the ignorant and the weak-minded as the receptacle or the habitation of a god or genius. Now all this is extremely erudite and profound, no doubt, but it lacks the merit of being either true or correct. Fetish may be an idol among the Negroes of Africa, according to Webster, and there are weak-minded and ignorant people certainly who are fetish worshippers. Yet the theory that certain objects, statues, images, and amulets for example serve as a temporary or even constant habitation to a god, genius or spirit simply, has been shared by some of the most intellectual men known to history. It was not originated by the ignorant and weak-minded, since the majority of the world's sages and philosophers, from credulous Pythagoras down to skeptical Lucian, believed in such a thing in antiquity, as in our highly civilized, cultured, and learned century. Several hundred millions of Christians still believe in it, whether the above definitions be correct or the one we shall now give. The administration of the sacrament, the mystery of transubstantiation in the supposed conversion of the bread and wine of the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ, would render the bread and wine and the communion cup along with them fetishes no less than the tree or rag or stone of the savage African. Every miracle-working image, tomb, and statue of a saint, virgin or Christ, in the Roman Catholic and Greek churches, have thus to be regarded as fetishes, because, whether the miracle is supposed to be wrought by God or an angel, by Christ or a saint, those images or statues do become, if the miracle be claimed as genuine, the receptacle or dwelling for a longer or shorter time of God or an angel of God. It is only in the Dictionnaire des Religions, article on fetish SME, that a pretty correct definition may be found. The word fetish was derived from the Portuguese word feitiço, enchanted, bewitched or charmed, whence fatum, destiny, fatua, fairy, etc. Fetish, moreover, was and still ought to be identical with idol, and as the author of the Teraphim of Idolatry says, fetishism is the adoration of any object, whether inorganic or living, large or of minute proportions, in which, or, in connection with which, any spirit, good or bad, in short an invisible intelligent power, has manifested its presence. Having collected for my secret doctrine a number of notes upon this subject, I may now give some of them apropos of the latest theosophical novel of Fallen Idol, and thus show that work of fiction based on some very occult truths of esoteric philosophy. The images of all the gods of antiquity, from the earliest Aryans down to the latest Semites the Jews, were all idols and fetishes, whether called teraphim, urim and thummim, kabari, or cherubs, or the gods Lares. If, speaking of the teraphim, a word that Grotius translates as angels, an etymology authorized by Cornelius, who says that they were the symbols of angelic presence, the Christians are allowed to call them the mediums through which divine presence was manifested. Why not apply the same to the idols of the heathen? I am perfectly alive to the fact that the modern man of science, like the average skeptic, believes no more in an animated image of the Roman Church than he does in the animated fetish of a savage. But there is no question, at present, of belief or disbelief. It is simply the evidence of antiquity embracing a period of several thousands of years, as against the denial of the 6th century, the century of spiritualism and spiritism, of theosophy and occultism, of Charcot and his hypnotism, of psychic suggestion, and of unrecognized black magic all round. Let us Europeans honor the religion of our forefathers, by questioning it on its beliefs and their origin, before placing on its defense pagan antiquity and its grand philosophy. Where do we find in Western sacred literature, so-called, the first mention of idols and fetishes? In chapter XXXI, et sec, of Genesis, in Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia, wherein the ancestors of Abraham, Sirach, and Terah, worshipped little idols in clay which they called their gods, and where also, in Haran, Rachel stole the images, teraphim, of her father Laban. Jacob may have forbidden the worship of those gods, yet one finds 325 years after that prohibition, the Mosaic Jews adoring the gods of the Amorites all the same. Joshua XXIV 14:15. The teraphim gods of Laban exist to this day among certain tribes of Musulmans on Persian territory. They are small statuettes of tutelary genii, or gods, which are consulted on every occasion. The rabbis explain that Rachel had no other motive for stealing her father's gods than that of preventing his learning from them the direction she and her husband Jacob had taken, lest he should prevent them from leaving his home once more. Thus, it was not piety, or the fear of the Lord God of Israel, but simply a dread of the indiscretion of the gods that made her secure them. Moreover, her mandrakes were only another kind of sortilegious and magical implements. Now what is the opinion of various classical and even sacred writers on these idols, which Hermes Trismegistus calls statues foreseeing futurity? Asclepius, 7 Philo of Biblis shows that the Jews consulted demons like the Amorites, especially through small statues made of gold, shaped as nymphs which, questioned at any hour, would instruct them what the Chairists had to do and what to avoid. Antiquities. In More Nevakim, I. 3, it is said that nothing resembled more those portative and preserving gods of the pagans di portables vel averunci, than those tutelary gods of the Jews. They were veritable phylacteries or animated talismans, the Spira Antiae Simulacra of Apuleius, Book 11, whose answers, given in the temple of the goddess of Syria, were heard by Lucian personally, and repeated by him. Kircher, the Jesuit father, shows also that the teraphim looked, in quite an extraordinary way, like the pagan serapises of Egypt, and Cedrina seems to corroborate that statement of Kircher, in his Vol. 3, p. 494, Oedipus, etc., by showing that the T and the S, like the Sanskrit S and the Zend H, were convertible letters, the seraphim, or serapis, and the teraphim, being absolute synonyms. As to the use of these idols, Maimonides tells us, More Nevakim, p. 41, that these gods or images passed for being endowed with the prophetic gift, and as being able to tell the people in whose possession they were all that was useful and salutary for them. All these images, we are told, had the form of a baby or small child, others were only occasionally much larger. They were statues or regular idols in the human shape. The Chaldeans exposed them to the beams of certain planets for the latter to imbue them with their virtues and potency. These were for purposes of astro-magic, the regular teraphim for those of necromancy and sorcery, in most cases. The spirits of the dead, elementaries, were attached to them by magic art, and they were used for various sinful purposes. Ugolino one puts in the mouth of the sage Gamaliel, St. Paul's master, or guru, the following words, which he quotes. He says, from his Capito, chap, XXXVI, they, the possessors of such necromantic teraphim, killed a newborn baby, cut off its head, and placed under its tongue, salted and oiled, a little gold lamina in which the name of an evil spirit was perforated. Then, after suspending that head on the wall of their chamber, they lighted lamps before it, and prostrate on the ground they conversed with it. The learned Marquis de Merville believes that it was just such ex-human fetishes that were meant by Philostratus, who gives a number of instances of the same. There was the head of Orpheus, he says, which spoke to Cyrus, and the head of a priest sacrificer from the temple of Jupiter Hoplosmius which, when severed from its body, revealed, as Aristotle narrates, the name of its murderer, one called Sensitas, and the head of one Publius Capitanus, which, according to Trallianus, at the moment of the victory won by Asilius the Roman consul, over Antiochus, king of Asia, predicted to the Romans the great misfortunes that would soon befall them, and c. P.N. Des Esprits, Volume 3, 29 Memoir to the Academy, p. 252. Diodorus tells the world how such idols were fabricated for magical purposes in days of old. Semele, the daughter of Cadmus, having, in consequence of a fright, given premature birth to a child of 7 months, Cadmus, in order to follow the custom of his country and to give it, the babe, a supermundane origin which would make it live after death, enclosed its body within a gold statue, and made of it an idol for which a special cult and rites were established. Diodorus, lib. ip. 48. As Frérot, in his article in the Memoirs de one Académie des Inscriptions, vol. XXIII, p. 247 pointedly remarks, when com1 Ugolino Thesaur volume XXIII, p. 475. Menting upon the above passage, a singular thing, deserving still more attention, is that the said consecration of Semele's baby, which the Orphics show as having been the custom of Cadmus' ancestors, is precisely the ceremony described by the rabbis, as cited by Celdinus, with regard to the teraphim or household gods of the Syrians and the Phoenicians. There is little probability, however, that the Jews should have been acquainted with the Orphics. Thus, there is every reason to believe that the numerous drawings in Father Kircher's See Oedipus, little figures and heads with metallic laminae protruding from under their tongues, which hang entirely out of the heads' mouths, are real and genuine teraphims as shown by de Merville. Then again in L. E. Blank's Religions, Volume 3, p. 277, speaking of the Phoenician teraphim, the author compares them to the Greco-Phrygian Palladium, which contained human relics. All the mysteries of the apotheosis, of orgies, sacrifices and magic, were applied to such heads. A child young enough to have his innocent soul still united with the anima mundi, the mundane soul, was killed, he says, his head was embalmed and its soul was fixed in it, as it is averred, by the power of magic and enchantments. After which followed the usual process, the gold lamina, etc., etc. Now this is terrible black magic, we say, and none but the Dugpas of old, the villainous sorcerers of antiquity, used it. In the Middle Ages only several Roman Catholic priests are known to have resorted to it, among others the apostate Jacobin priest in the service of Queen Catherine of Medici, that faithful daughter of the Church of Rome and the author of the St. Bartholomew Massacre. The story is given by Bodin, in his famous work on sorcery Le Demonomaniac, Au Traité des Sorciers, Paris, 1587, and it is quoted in Isis Unveiled, Vol. 2, p. 56. Pope Sylvester II was publicly accused by Cardinal Beno of sorcery, on account of his brazen oracular head. These heads and other talking statues, trophies of the magical skill of monks and bishops, were facsimiles of the animated gods of the ancient temples. Benedict IX, John the 20th, and the VLTH and VLLTH Popes Gregory are all known in history as sorcerers and magicians. Notwithstanding such an array of facts to show that the Latin Church has despoiled the ancient Jews of all even to their knowledge of black art, inclusively one of their advocates of modern times, namely, the Marquis de Merville, is not ashamed to publish against the modern Jews, the most terrible and foul of accusations. In his violent polemics with the French symbologists, who try to find a philosophical explanation for ancient Bible customs and rites, he says, we pass over the symbolic significations that are sought for to explain all such customs of the idolatrous Jews. Their human teraphim and severed baby heads, because we do not believe in them, such explanations, at all. But we do believe, for one, that the head consulted by the Scandinavian Odin in every difficult affair was a teraphim of the same, magic, class. And that in which we believe still more, is, that all those mysterious disappearances and abductions of small, Christian, children, practiced at all times and even in our own day by the Jews are the direct consequences of those ancient and barbarous necromantic practices. Let the reader remember the incident of Damas and Father Thomas. Nom des Esprits, Volume 3, p. 254. Quite clear and unmistakable this. The unfortunate, despoiled Israelites are plainly charged with abducting Christian children to behead and make oracular heads with them, for purposes of sorcery. Where will bigotry and intolerance with their odium theologicum land next, I wonder? On the contrary, it seems quite evident that it is just in consequence of such terrible malpractices of occultism that Moses and the early ancestors of the Jews were so strict in carrying out the severe prohibition against graven images, statues, and likenesses in any shape, of either gods or living men. This same reason was at the bottom of the like prohibition by Mohammed and enforced by all the Mussulman prophets. For the likeness of any person, in whatever form and mode, of whatever material, may be turned into a deadly weapon against the original by a really learned practitioner of the black art. Legal authorities during the Middle Ages, and even some of 200 years ago, were not wrong in putting to death those in whose possession small wax figures of their enemies were found, for it was murder contemplated, pure and simple. Thou shalt not draw the vital spirits of thy enemy, or of any person into his simulacrum, for this is a heinous crime against nature. And again, any object into which the fiat of a spirit has been drawn is dangerous, and must not be left in the hands of the ignorant. An expert, in magic, has to be called. To purify it. Pract. Laws of Occult Science, Book V, Coptic copy. In a kind of manual of elementary occultism, it is said, to make a bewitched object, fetish, harmless, its parts have to be reduced to atoms, broken, and the whole buried in damp soil, follow instructions, unnecessary in a publication. That which is called vital spirits is the astral body. Souls, whether united or separated from their bodies, have a corporeal substance inherent to their nature, says St. Hilarion. COMM, in Math. CV No 8. Now the astral body of a living person, of one unlearned in occult sciences, may be forced, by an expert in magic, to animate, or be drawn to, and then fixed within any object, especially into anything made in his likeness, a portrait, a statue, a little figure in wax, and and as whatever hits or affects the astral reacts by repercussion on the physical body, it becomes logical and stands to reason that, by stabbing the likeness in its vital parts, the heart, for instance, the original may be sympathetically killed, without any one being able to detect the cause of it. The Egyptians, who separated man, exoteric alpha, into three divisions or groups: mind, body, pure spirit, our seventh and sixth prin, the spectral soul, the fifth, fourth, and third principles, and the gross body, prana and stula sarara, called forth in their theurgies and evocations, for divine white magical purposes, as well as for those of the black art, the spectral soul, or astral body, as we call it. It was not the soul itself that was evoked, but its simulacrum that the Greeks called eidolon, and which was the middle principles between soul and body. That doctrine came from the East, the cradle of all learning. The Magi of Chaldea, as well as all other followers of Zoroaster, believed that it was not the divine soul alone, spirit, which would participate in the glory of celestial light, but also the sensitive soul. Celis, in Scholies in Auric. Translated into our theosophical phraseology, the above refers to Atma and Buddhi, the vehicle of spirit. The Neoplatonics, and even Origen, call the astral body agoides and astroides, i.e., one having the brilliancy of the stars. Sciences Occults, by C.T.E. Derisi, Volume 2, p. 598-9. Generally speaking, the world's ignorance on the nature of the author of a fallen idol, whether through natural intuition or study of occult laws, it is for him to say, shows knowledge of this fact by making Nebelson say that the spinty of the Tirthankar was paralyzed and torpid during the time his idol had been buried in India. That eidolon or elementary could do nothing, cp. 295. Human phantom and vital principle, as on the functions of all man's principles, is deplorable. Whereas science denies them all, an easy way of cutting the Gordian knot of the difficulty, the churches have evolved the fanciful dogma of one solitary principle, the soul, and neither of the two will stir from its respective preconceptions, notwithstanding the evidence of all antiquity and its most intellectual writers. Therefore, before the question can be argued with any hope of lucidity, the following points have to be settled and studied by our Theosophists, those, at any rate, who are interested in the subject. 1. The difference between a physiological hallucination and a psychic or spiritual clairvoyance and clairaudience. 2. Spirits, or the entities of certain invisible beings, whether ghosts of once living men, angels, spirits, or elementals, have they, or have they not, a natural though an ethereal and to us invisible body? Are they united to, or can they assimilate some fluidic substance that would help them to become visible to men? 3. Have they, or have they not, the power of so becoming infused among the atoms of any object, whether it be a statue, idol, a picture, or an amulet, as to impart to it their potency and Tuesday, and even to animate it? 4. Is it in the power of any adept, yogi or initiate, to fix such entities, whether by white or black magic, in certain objects? 5. What are the various conditions, save nirvana and avicii, of good and bad men after death? Etc., etc. All this may be studied in the literature of the ancient classics, and especially in Aryan literature. Meanwhile, I have tried to explain and have given the collective and individual opinions thereon of all the great philosophers of antiquity in my secret doctrine. I hope the book will now very soon appear. Only, in order to counteract the effects of such humoristical works as A Fallen Idol on weak-minded people, who see in it only a satire upon our beliefs, I thought best to give here the testimony of the ages to the effect that such post-mortem pranks as played by Mr. Ansti's sham ascetic, who died a sudden death, are of no rare occurrence in nature. To conclude, the reader may be reminded that if the astral body of man is no superstition founded on mere hallucinations, but a reality in nature, then it becomes only logical that such an eidolon, whose individuality is all centered after death in his personal ego, should be attracted to the remains of the body that was his, during life. 8. And in case the latter was burnt and the ashes buried, that it should seek to prolong its existence vicariously by either possessing itself of some living body, a medium's, or, by attaching itself to his own statue, picture, or some familiar object in the house or locality that it inhabited. The vampire theory can hardly be a superstition altogether. Throughout all Europe, in Germany, Styria, Moldavia, Servia, France, and Russia, those bodies of the deceased who are believed to have become vampires, have special exorcismal rites established for them by their respective churches. Both the Greek and Latin religions think it beneficent to have such bodies dug out and transfixed to the earth by a pole of aspen tree wood. However it may be, whether truth or superstition, ancient philosophers and poets, classics and lay writers, have believed as we do now, and that for several thousand years in history, that man had within him his astral counterpart, which would appear by separating itself or oozing out of the gross body, during life as well as after the death of the latter. Till that moment the spectral soul was the vehicle of the divine soul and the pure spirit. But, as soon as the flames had devoured the physical envelope, the spiritual soul, separating itself from the simulacrum of man, ascended to its new home of unalloyed bliss, Devachan or swore. Ga, while the spectral eidolon descended into the regions of Hades, Limbus, Purgatory, or Kamaloka. I have terminated my earthly career, exclaims Dido, my glorious spectre, astral body, the image of my person, will now descend into the womb of the earth. For et nunc magna me sub terras ibit imago, Aeneid, Lib 4, 654. Sabinus and Servius Honoratus, a learned commentator of Virgil of the Vithcent, have taught, as shown by Dulrus, the Daemonlogion, Lib. 2, chxx and xxv, p. 116, that man was composed, besides his soul, of a shadow umbra, and a body. The soul ascends to heaven, the body is pulverized, and the shadow is plunged in Hades. This phantom umbra SCU simulacrum is not a real body, they say, it is the appearance of one, that no hand can touch, as it avoids contact like a breath. Homer shows this same 3 even burning does not affect its interference or prevent it entirely, since it can avail itself of the ashes. Earth alone will make it powerless. For which is not the interior of the earth, or hell, as taught by the anti-geological theologians, but the cosmic matrix of its region, the astral light of our atmosphere. Shadow in the phantom of Patroclus, who perished, killed by Hector, and yet here he is, it is his face, his voice, his blood still flowing from his wounds. See Iliad, XXIII, and also Odyssey, I, 11. The ancient Greeks and Latins had 2 souls, anima hruta and anima divina, the first of which is in Homer the animal soul, the image and the life of the body, and the second, the immortal and the divine. As to our Kamaloka, Ennius, says Lucercius, has traced the picture of the sacred regions in Acre Usia, where dwell neither our bodies nor our souls, but only our simulacres, whose pallidity is dreadful to behold. It is amongst those shades that divine Homer appeared to him, shedding bitter tears as though the gods had created that honest man for eternal sorrow only. It is from the midst of that world, Kamaloka, which seeks with avidity communication with our own, that this third part of the poet, his phantom, explained to him the mysteries of nature. Pythagoras and Plato both divided soul into 2 representative parts, independent of each other, the one, the rational soul, or, the other, irrational, the latter being again subdivided into 2 parts or aspects, the asterisk, and the asterisk, which, with the divine soul and its spirit and the body, make the 7 principles of Theosophy. What Virgil calls imago, image, Lucretius names simulacrum, similitude, c de nat rerum I, but they are all names for one and the same thing, the astral body. We gather thus 2 points from the ancients entirely corroborative of our esoteric philosophy. A. The astral or materialized figure of the dead is neither the soul, nor the spirit, nor the body of the deceased personage, but simply the shadow thereof, which justifies our calling it a shell, and, b. Unless it be an immortal God, an angel, who animates an object, it can never be a spirit, to wit, the soul, or real, spiritual ego of a once living man, for these ascend, and an astral shadow, unless it be of a living person, can never be higher than a terrestrial, earthbound ego, or an irrational shell. Homer was therefore right in making Telemachus exclaim, on seeing Ulysses, who reveals himself to his 6 Seaker usia temple quo nec permanent animi, nec corpora nostra, sed custom simulacra, mod is Paul Anchiamiris. Unde sibi exortum semper florentis homeri cum morat speciem lacrimas et funderis salsus copus, et rerum naturam, expandere dictus. Son, no, thou art not my father, thou art a demon, a spirit who flatters and deludes me. Asterisk, Odyssey, 16, 194. It is such elusive shadows, belonging to neither earth nor heaven, that are used by sorcerers and other adepts of the black art, to help them in persecutions of victims, to hallucinate the minds of very honest and well-meaning persons occasionally, who fall victims to the mental epidemics aroused by them for a purpose, and to oppose in every way the beneficent work of the guardians of mankind, whether divine or human. For the present, enough has been said to show that the Theosophists have the evidence of the whole of antiquity in support of the correctness of their doctrines. H.P. Blavatsky note. As a corroboration of the theory that a great volume of psychic force may be concentrated in an object of worship, we may add the following biblical narrative of the overthrow of the image of the idol Dagon, in its own temple, by the superior power of the Hebraic Ark. It runs thus: when the Philistines took the Ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon, and set it by Dagon. And when they of Ashdod arose early on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And they took Dagon, and set him in his place again. And when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon, and both the palms of his hands were cut off. Upon the threshold, only the stump of Dagon was left to him. Isam v 3 and 4. Lucifer, November, 1891. Chinese spirits He following notes have been collected partly from an old work by a French missionary who lived in China for over 40 years, some from a very curious unpublished work by an American gentleman who has kindly lent the writer his notes, some from information given by the Abbé Hugh to the Chevalier de Musso and the Marquis de Merville. For these the last two gentlemen are responsible. Most of our facts, however, come from a Chinese gentleman residing for some years in Europe. Man, according to the Chinaman, is composed of 4 root substances and 3 acquired semblances. This is the magical and universal occult tradition, dating from an antiquity which has its origin in the night of time. A Latin poet shows the same source of information in his country, when declaring that, bis duo sunt hominis, manes, caro, spiritus, umbra, quaetu or ista loca bis duo suscipiunt. Terra tagit carnum, tumulum circumvalat umbra, orcus habet manes, spiritus astra peti. The phantom known and described in the Celestial Empire is quite orthodox according to occult teachings, though there exist several theories in China upon it. The human soul, says the chief temple teaching, helps man to become a rational and intelligent creature, but it is neither simple, homogeneous, nor spiritual, it is a compound of all that is subtle in matter. This soul is divided by its nature and actions into 2 principal parts, the Ling and the Haoan. The Ling is the better adapted of the 2 for spiritual and intellectual operations, and has an upper Ling or soul over it which is divine. Moreover, out of the union of the lower Ling and Haoan is formed, during man's life, a third and mixed being, fit for both intellectual and physical processes, for good and evil, while the Haoan is absolutely bad. Thus we have 4 principles in these 2 substances, which correspond, as is evident, to our Buddhi, the divine upper Ling, to Manas, the lower Ling, whose twin, the Haoan, stands for Kamarupa, the body of passion, desire, and evil, and then we have in the mixed being the outcome or progeny of both Ling and Haoan, the Mayavi, the astral body. Then comes the definition of the third root substance. This is attached to the body only during life, the body being the 4th substance, pure matter, and after the death of the latter, separating itself from the corpse but not before its complete dissolution, it vanishes in thin air like a shadow with the last particle of the substance that generated it. This is of course prana, the life principle or vital form. Now, when man dies, the following takes place: the upper ling ascends heavenward into nirvana, the paradise of Amitabha, or any other region of bliss that agrees with the respective sect of each Chinaman, carried off by the spirit of the dragon of wisdom. The seventh principle, the body and its principle vanish gradually and are annihilated, remain the Linghaoan and the mixed being. If the man was good, the mixed being disappears also after a time; if he was bad and was entirely under the sway of Haoan, the absolutely evil principle, then the latter transforms his mixed being into Kaos, which answers to the Catholic idea of a damned soul one, and, imparting to it a terrible vitality and power, the Kaos becomes the alter ego and the executioner of Haoan in all his wicked deeds. The Haoan and Kaos unite into one shadowy but strong entity, and may, by separating at will, and acting in two different places at a time, do terrible mischief. The Kaos is an anima damnata according to the good missionaries, who thus make of the milliards of deceased unbaptized Chinamen an army of devils, who, considering they are of a material substance, ought by this time to occupy the space between our earth and the moon and feel themselves as much at ease as closely packed up herrings in a tin box. The Kaos, being naturally wicked, says the memoir, do all the evil they can. They hold the middle between man and the brute and participate of the faculties of both. They have all the vices of man and every dangerous instinct of the animal. Sentenced to ascend no higher than our atmosphere, they congregate around the tombs and in the vicinity of mines, swamps, sinks and slaughterhouses, everywhere wherein rottenness and decay are found. The emanations of the latter are their favorite food, and it is with the help one the spiritual portion of the ling becomes Chen, divine and saintly, after death, to become Hein, an absolute saint, a nirvani when joined entirely with the dragon of wisdom. Of those elements and atoms, and of the vapors from corpses, that they form for themselves visible and fantastic bodies to deceive and frighten men with. These miserable spirits with deceptive bodies seek incessantly the means for preventing men from getting salvation, read, being baptized, and of forcing them to become damned as they themselves are. p. 222, Memoirs concernant V'istoire, lay sciences, lay arts, lay measures, etc., de Chinois, par les missionaries de Peking, 1791. 2. This is how our old friend, the Abbé Hugh, the Lazarist, unfrocked for showing the origin of certain Roman Catholic rites in Tibet and China, describes the Haoan. What is the Haoan is a question to which it is difficult to give a clear answer. It is, if you so like it, something vague, something between a spirit, a genii, and vitality. See Hugh's Voyage a Chine, Vol. N. p. 394. He seems to regard the Haoan as the future operator in the business of resurrection, which it will effect by attracting to itself the atomic substance of the body, which will be thus reformed on the day of resurrection. This answers well enough the Christian idea of one body and merely one personality to be resurrected. But if the Haoan has to unite on that day the atoms of all the bodies the monad had passed through and inhabited, then even that very cunning creature might find itself not quite equal to the occasion. However, as while the ling is plunged in felicity, its ex-Haoan is left behind to wonder and suffer, it is evident that the Haoan and the elementary are identical. As it is also undeniable that had disembodied man the faculty of being at one and the same time in Devachan and in Kamaloka, whence he might come to us, and put in an occasional appearance in a seance room or elsewhere, then man as just shown by the ling or 2. According to the most ancient doctrines of magic, violent deaths and leaving the body exposed, instead of burning or burying it, led to the discomfort and pain of its astral, lingasarara, which died out only at the dissolution of the last particle of the matter that had composed the body. Sorcery or black magic, it is said, had always availed itself of this knowledge for necromantic and sinful purposes. Sorcerers offer to unrestful souls decayed remnants of animals to force them to appear, see Porphyry, Sacrifice. Saint Athanasius was accused of the black art, for having preserved the hand of Bishop Arsenius for magical operations. Patet quod animi ilsqui, post mortem, ad hoc, relicta corpora diligunt, quam ad magem animi sepultura carentium, et ad hoc in turbido illo humidici spiritu the spiritual or fluidic body, the hauen circa cadavera sua oberant. Tanquam circa si ognitum aliquadias alicians, etc. See Cornelius Agrippa de Occulta Philosophia, pages 354-5, Le Fantôme Humain by de Wasio. Homer and Horace have described many a time such evocations. In India it is practiced to this day by some tantrikas. Thus modern sorcery, as well as white magic, occultism and spiritualism, with their branches of mesmerism, hypnotism, etc., show their doctrines and methods linked to those of the highest antiquity, since the same ideas, beliefs, and practices are found now as in old Aryavarta, Egypt and China, Greece and Rome. Read the treatise, careful and truthful as to facts, however erroneous as to the author's conclusions, by P. Thieri, Loca Infesta, and you will find that the localities most favorable for the evocations of spirits are those where a murder has been committed, a burying ground, deserted places, etc. Hauen would be possessed of the double faculty of experiencing a simultaneous and distinct feeling of two contraries, bliss and torture. The ancients understood so well the absurdity of this theory, knowing that no absolute bliss could have place wherein there was the smallest alloy of misery, that while supposing the higher ego of Homer to be in Elysium, they showed the Homer weeping by the acre usia as no better than the simulacrum of the poet, his empty and deceptive image, or what we call the shell of the false personality. There is but one real ego in each man, and it must necessarily be either in one place or in another, in bliss or in grief. 3. For the Hauen, to return to it, is said to be the terror of men. In China, that horrid spectre troubles the living, penetrates into houses and closed objects, and takes possession of people, as spirits are shown to do in Europe and America. The Hauens of children being of still greater malice than the Hauens of adults. This belief is so strong in China that when they want to get rid of a child they carry it far away from home, hoping thereby to puzzle the Hauen and make him lose his way home. As the Hauen is the fluidic or gaseous likeness of its defunct body, in judicial medicine experts use this likeness in cases of suspected murders to get at the truth. The formulas used to evoke the Hauen of a person dying under suspicious circumstances are officially accepted, and these means are resorted to very often, according to Hugh, who told de Musso, see Les Mediateurs de la Magie, p. 310, that the instructing magistrate, after having recited the evocation over the corpse, used vinegar mixed with some mysterious ingredients, as might any other necromancer. When the Hauen has appeared, it is always in the likeness of the 3C Lucretius de Natrirum I, who calls it a simulacrum. For though antiquity, like esoteric philosophy, seems to divide soul into the divine and the animal, anima divina and nima bruta, the former being called nous and phrin, yet the two were but the double aspect of a unity. Diogenes Laertius, de Vit. Clar. Verk. I. 8. 30, gives the common belief that the animal soul, phrin, generally the diaphragm, resided in the stomach, Diogenes calling the anima bruta, Pythagoras and Plato also make the same division, calling the divine or rational soul, and the irrational. Empedocles gives to men and animals a dual soul, not two souls as is believed. The Theosophists and Occultists divide man into 7 principles and speak of a divine and animal soul, but they add that spirit being one and indivisible, all these souls and principles are only its aspects. Spirit alone is immortal, infinite, and the one reality, the rest is all evanescent and temporary. Illusion and delusion. De Musso is very wroth with the late Baron du Potet, who places an intelligent spirit in each of our organs, simply because he is unable to grasp the Baron's idea. Victim as it was at the moment of its death. If the body has been burned before judicial inquiry, the Howen reproduces on its body the wounds or lesions received by the murdered man. The crime is proven and justice takes note of it. The sacred books of the temples contain the complete formulae of such evocations, and even the name of the murderer may be forced from the complacent Howen. In this the Chinamen were followed by Christian nations. However, during the Middle Ages the suspected murderer was placed by the judges before the victim, and if at that moment blood began to flow from the open wounds, it was held as a sign that the accused was the criminal. This belief survives to this day in France, Germany, Russia, and all the Slavonian countries. The wounds of a murdered man will reopen at the approach of his murderer, says a jurisprudential work, Binsfeld, de Conf. Mail/. p. 136. The Howen can neither be buried underground nor drowned, he travels above the ground and prefers keeping at home. In the province of Honan the teaching varies. Delaplace, a bishop in China 5, tells of the heathen Chinese most extraordinary stories with regard to this subject. Every man, they say, has 3 Howens in him. At death one of the Liuans incarnates in a body he selects for himself, the other remains in, and with, the family, and becomes the lar, and the third watches the tomb of its corpse. Papers and incense are burnt in honor of the latter, as a sacrifice to the manes. The domestic Howen takes his abode in the family record tablets amidst engraved characters, and sacrifice is also offered to him. Hyangs, sticks made of incense, are burnt in his honor, and funeral repasts are prepared for him, in which case the 2 Howens will keep quiet if they are those of adults, not a bani. Then follows a series of ghastly stories. If we read the whole literature of magic from Homer down to Dupotet, we shall find everywhere the same assertion: man is a triple, and esoterically a septenary, compound of mind, of reason, and of an eidolon. And these 3 are, during life, 1. I call the soul's idol that power which vivifies and governs the body, whence are derived the senses, and through which the soul displays the strength of the senses and feeds a body within another body. Meiji de Voily, Dupotet, p. 250, 5 Annales de la Propagation de la Foi, number 143, July, 1852. Triplex unicuc homini daemon, bonus est proprius custos, said Cornelius Agrippa, from whom Dupotet had the idea about the soul's idol. For Cornelius says, anima humana constat ment, ratione et idolo. Mens illuminat rationem, ratio flut in idolum, idolum autem anam registered trademark est supernaturum chu registered trademark corporis et anima, quodam modo notus est dico autem anam registered trademark idolum, potentiam illum vivicativam et rectressem corporis sensuum originum, perquam. A lit in corpore corpus, de occulta philos, pages 357, 358. This is the Howen of China, once we divest him of the excrescence of popular superstition and fancy. Nevertheless, the remark of a Brahmin made in the review of A Fallen Idol, Theosophist. September, 1886. p. 793, whether meant seriously or otherwise by the writer that if the rules or mathematical proportions and measurements are not accurately followed in every detail, an idol is liable to be taken possession of by some power. Full evil spirit is quite true. And as a moral law of nature a counterpart to the mathematical, if the rules of harmony in the world of causes and effects are not observed during life, then our inner idol is as liable to turn out a maleficent demon, a hoot, and to be taken possession of by other evil spirits, which are called by us elementaries though treated almost as gods by sentimental ignoramuses. Between these and those who, like de Musso and de Merville, write volumes a whole library, to prove that with the exception of a few biblical apparitions and those that have fought devoured Christian saints and good Catholics, there never was a phantom, ghost, spirit, or god, that had appeared that was not a Farrier, an impostor, a usurpator Satan. In short, in one of his masquerades there is a long way and a wide margin for him who would study occult laws and esoteric philosophy. A god who eats and drinks and receives sacrifice and honor can be but an evil spirit, argues de Merville. The bodies of the evil spirits who were angels have deteriorated by their fall and partake of the qualities of a more condensed air ether, teaches de Musso, Le Monde Magique, p. 287, and this is the reason of their appetite when they devour the funeral repasts the Chinese serve before them to propitiate them. They are demons. Well, if we go back to the supposed origin of Judaism and the Israelite nation, we find angels of light doing just the same. If good appetite be a sign of satanic nature, and it is the same de Musso who, unconsciously, lays, for himself and his religion, a trap. See, he exclaims, the angels of God descend under the green trees near Abraham's tent. They eat with appetite the bread and meat, the butter and the milk prepared for them by the patriarch, General 18, 2, et sec. Abraham dressed a whole calf tender and good, and they did eat, v. 7 and 8, and baked cakes and milk and butter besides. Was their appetite any more divine than that of a John King drinking tea with rum and eating toast in the room of an English medium, or than the appetite of a Chinese Ituan? The Church has the power of discernment, we are assured. She knows the difference between the three, and judges by their bodies. Let us see. These the biblical are real, genuine spirits. Angels, beyond any doubt, certes, argues de Musso. Theirs are bodies which, no doubt, in dilating could, in virtue of the extreme tenuity of the substance, become transparent, then melt away, dissolve, lose their color, become less and less visible, and finally disappear from our sight, p. 388, so can a John King, we are assured, and a Peking Howen, no doubt. Who or what then can teach us the difference if we fail to study the uninterrupted evidence of the classics and the theurgists, and neglect the occult sciences? Nature's human magnets. If any of us nowadays ventures to relate some weird experience or seemingly incomprehensible phenomenon, two classes of objectors try to stop his mouth with the same gag. The scientist cries, I have unraveled all nature's skein, and the thing is impossible, this is no age for miracles. The Hindu bigot says this is the Kali Yuga, the spiritual night time of humanity, miracles are no longer possible. Thus the one from conceit, the other from ignorance reaches the same conclusion. Viz., that nothing that smacks of the supernatural is possible in these latter days. The Hindu, however, believes that miracles did once occur, while the scientist does not. As for the bigoted Christians, this is not a Kali Yuga, but if one might judge by what they say, a golden era of light, in which the splendor of the gospel is illuminating humanity and pushing it onward towards greater intellectual triumphs. And as they base all their faith upon miracles, they pretend that miracles are being wrought now by God and the Virgin, principally the latter, just as in ancient times. Our own views are well known. We do not believe a miracle ever did occur or ever will. We do believe that strange phenomena, falsely styled miraculous, always did occur, are occurring now, and will to the end of time, that these are natural, and that when this fact filters into the consciousness of materialistic skeptics, science will go at leaps and bounds towards that ultimate truth she has so long been groping after. It is a wearisome and disheartening experience to tell anyone about the phenomena of the less familiar side of nature. The smile of incredulity is too often followed by the insulting challenge of one's veracity or the attempted impugnment of one's character. 100 impossible theories will be broached to escape accepting the only right one. Your brain must have been surexcited, your nerves are hallucinated, a glamour has been cast over you. If the phenomenon has left behind a positive, tangible, undeniable proof, then comes the skeptic's last resource, confederacy, involving an amount of expenditure, time, and trouble totally incommensurate with the results to be hoped for. And despite the absence of the least possible evil motive. If we lay down the proposition that everything is the result of combined force and matter, science will approve, but when we move on and say that we have seen phenomena and account for them under this very law, this presumptuous science, having never seen your phenomenon, denies both your premise and conclusion, and falls to calling you harsh names. So it all comes back to the question of personal credibility as a witness, and the man of science, until some happy accident forces the new fact upon his attention, is like the child who screams at the veiled figure he takes for a ghost, but which is only his nurse after all. If we but wait with patience, we shall see some day a majority of the professors coming over to the side where Hare, De Morgan, Flammarion, Crookes, Wallace, Zollner, Weber, Wagner, and Buttelroth have ranged themselves, and then, though miracles will be considered as much an absurdity as now, yet occult phenomena will be duly taken inside the domain of exact science, and men will be wiser. These circumscribing barriers are being vigorously assaulted just now at St. Petersburg. A young girl medium is shocking all the wiseacres of the university. For years mediumship seemed to be represented in the Russian metropolis but by American, English and French mediums on flying visits, with great pecuniary pretensions and, except Drive Slade, the New York medium, with powers already waning. Very naturally the representatives of science found a good pretext to decline. But now all excuses are futile. Not far from Petersburg, in a small hamlet inhabited by 3 families of German colonists, a few years ago a widow, named Margaret Beach, took a little girl from the house of foundlings into her service. The little Pelagueia was liked in the family from the first for her sweet disposition, her hard-working zeal, and her great truthfulness. She found herself exceedingly happy in her new home, and for several years no one ever had a cross word for her. Pelagueia finally became a good-looking lass of 17, but her temper never changed. She loved her masters fondly and was beloved in the house. Notwithstanding her good looks and sympathetic person, no village lad ever thought of offering himself as a husband. The young men said she awed them. They looked upon her as people look in those regions upon the image of a saint. So at least say the Russian papers and the police gazette, from which we quote the report of the district police officer sent to investigate certain facts of diablerie. For this innocent young creature has just become the victim of the weird doings of some incomprehensible, invisible agency, says the report. November 3, 1880, accompanied by a farm servant, she descended into the cellar under the house to get some potatoes. Hardly had they opened the heavy door, when they found themselves pelted with the vegetable. Believing some neighbor's boy must have hidden himself on the wide shelf on which the potatoes were heaped, Pelagueia, placing the basket upon her head, laughingly remarked, "Whoever you are, fill it with potatoes and so help me." In an instant the basket was filled to the brim. Then the other girl tried the same, but the potatoes remained motionless. Climbing upon the shelf, to their amazement the girls found no one there. Having notified the widow Beach of the strange occurrence, the latter went herself, and unlocking the cellar which had been securely locked by the 2 maids on leaving, found no one concealed in it. This event was but the precursor of a series of others. During a period of 3 weeks they succeeded each other with such a rapidity that if we were to translate the entire official report it might fill this whole issue of the Theosophist. We will cite but a few. From the moment she left the cellar the invisible power which had filled her basket with potatoes, began to assert its presence incessantly, and in the most varied ways. Does Pelagueia Nikolov prepare to lay wood in the oven, the billets rise in the air and like living things jump upon the fireplace. Hardly does she apply a match to them when they blaze already as if fanned by an invisible hand. When she approaches the well, the water begins rising, and soon overflowing the sides of the cistern runs in torrents to her feet. Does she happen to pass near a bucket of water, the same thing happens. Hardly does the girl stretch out her hand to reach from the shelf some needed piece of crockery, then the whole of the earthenware, cups, tureens, and plates, as if snatched from their places by a whirlwind, begin to jump and tremble, and then fall with a crash at her feet. No sooner does an invalid neighbor place herself for a moment's rest on the girl's bed, than the heavy bedstead is seen levitating towards the very ceiling, then turns upside down and tosses off the impertinent intruder, after which it quietly resumes its former position. One day, having gone to the shed to do her usual evening work of feeding the cattle, Pelagueia, after performing her duty, was preparing to leave it with 2 other servants, when the most extraordinary scene took place. All the cows and pigs seemed to become suddenly possessed. The former, frightening the whole village with the most infuriating bellowing, tried to climb up the mangers, while the latter knocked their heads against the walls, running round as if pursued by some wild animal. Pitchforks, shovels, benches and feeding trough, snatching away from their places, pursued the terrified girls, who escaped within an inch of their lives by violently shutting and locking the door of the stables. But, as soon as this was done, every noise ceased inside as if by magic. All such phenomena took place not in darkness or during night, but in the daytime, and in the full view of the inhabitants of the little hamlet. Moreover, they were always preceded by an extraordinary noise, as if of a howling wind, a cracking in the walls, and raps in the window frames and glass. A real panic got hold of the household and the inhabitants of the hamlet, which went on increasing at every new manifestation. A priest was called, of course, as though priests knew anything of magnetism. But with no good results. A couple of pots danced a jig on the shelf, an oven fork went stamping and jumping on the floor, and a heavy sewing machine followed suit. The news about the young witch and her struggle with the invisible imps ran round the whole district. Men and women from neighboring villages flocked to see the marvels. The same phenomena, often intensified, took place in their presence. Once when a crowd of men upon entering, placed their caps upon the table, every one of these jumped from it to the floor, and a heavy leather glove, circling round, struck its owner a pretty sound thump on his face and rejoined the fallen caps. Finally, notwithstanding the real affection the widow Beach felt for the poor orphan, towards the beginning of December, Pelagueia and her boxes were placed upon a cart, and after many a tear and warm expression of regret, she was sent off to the superintendent of the Foundling Hospital, the institution in which she was brought up. This gentleman, returning with the girl on the following day, was made a witness to the pranks of the same force, called in the police, and, after a careful inquest, had a procès-verbal signed by the authorities, and departed. This case having been narrated to a spiritist, a rich nobleman residing at St. Petersburg, the latter betook himself immediately after the young girl and carried her away with him to town. The above officially noted facts are being reprinted in every Russian daily organ of note. The prologue finished, we are put in a position to follow the subsequent development of the power in this wonderful medium, as we find them commented upon in all the serious and arch-official papers of the metropolis. A new star on the horizon of spiritism has suddenly appeared at St. Petersburg 1 mile. Pelagueia thus speaks an editorial in the Novoye Vremya, January 1, 1881. The manifestations which have taken place in her presence are so extraordinary and powerful that more than one devout spiritualist seems to have been upset by them literally and by the agency of a heavy table. But, adds the paper, the spiritual victims do not seem to have felt in the least annoyed by such striking proofs. On the contrary, hardly had they picked themselves up from the floor, one of them before being able to resume his perpendicular position had to crawl out from beneath the sofa whither he had been launched by a heavy table. Then, forgetting their bruises, they proceeded to embrace each other in rapturous joy, and with eyes overflowing with tears, congratulate each other upon this new manifestation of the mysterious force. In this St. Petersburg Gazette, a merry reporter gives the following details. Miss Pelagueia is a young girl of about 19, the daughter of poor but dishonest parents, who had thrust her in the Foundling Hospital, as given above, not very pretty, but with a sympathetic face, very uneducated but intelligent, small in stature but kind at heart, well proportioned but nervous. Miss Pelagueia has suddenly manifested most wonderful mediumistic faculties. She is a first-class spiritistic star, as they call her. And, indeed, the young lady seems to have concentrated in her extremities a phenomenal abundance of magnetic aura, thanks to which, she communicates instantaneously to the objects surrounding her hitherto unheard and unseen phenomenal motions. About 5 days ago, at a séance at which were present the most noted spiritualists and mediums of the St. Petersburg Grand Monde, 1 occurred the following. Having placed themselves with Pelagweii, we seriously doubt whether there ever will be more than there are now believers in spiritualism among the middle and lower classes of Russia. These are too sincerely devout, and believe too fervently in the devil to have any faith in spirits. Around a table, they, the spiritists, had barely time to sit down, when each of them received what seemed an electric shock. Suddenly, the table violently upset, chairs and all, scattering the enthusiastic company to quite a respectable distance. The medium found herself on the floor with the rest, and her chair began to perform a series of such wonderful aerial jumps that the terrified spiritists had to take to their heels and left the room in a hurry. Most opportunely, while the above case is under consideration, there comes from America the account of a lad whose system appears to be also abnormally charged with vital magnetism. The report, which is from the Catholic Mirror, says that the boy is the son of a M.R. and Mrs. John C. Collins, of St. Paul, in the state of Minnesota. His age is 10 years, and it is only recently that the magnetic condition has developed itself, a curious circumstance to be noted. Intellectually he is bright, his health is perfect, and he enters with zest into all boyish sports. His left hand has become a wonderfully strong magnet. Metal articles of light weight attach themselves to his hands so that considerable force is required to remove them. Knives, pins, needles, buttons, etc., enough to cover his hand, will thus attach themselves so firmly that they cannot be shaken off. Still more, the attraction is so strong that a common coal scuttle can be lifted by it, and heavier implements have been lifted by stronger persons taking hold of his arm. With heavy articles, however, the boy complains of sharp pains darting along his arm. In a lesser degree his left arm and the whole left side of his body exerts the same power, but it is not at all manifest on his right side. The only man who has thrown any great light upon the natural and abnormal magnetic conditions of the human body is the late Baron von Reichenbach of Vienna, a renowned chemist and the discoverer of a new force which is called odyle. His experiments lasted more than 5 years, and neither expense, time, nor trouble were grudged to make them conclusive. Physiologists had long observed, especially among hospital patients, that a large proportion of human beings can sensibly feel a peculiar influence, or aura, proceeding from the magnet when downward passes are made along their persons but without touching them. And it was also observed that in such diseases as St. Vitus's dance, chorea, and various forms of paralysis, hysteria, and the patients showed the sensitiveness in a peculiar degree. But though the great Berzelius and other authorities in science had urged that men of science should investigate it, yet this most important field of research had been left almost untrodden until Baron Reichenbach undertook his great task. His discoveries were so important that they can only be fully appreciated by a careful reading of his book. Researches on magnetism, electricity, heat, light, crystallization, and chemical attraction, in their relations to the vital force, unfortunately out of print, but of which copies may be occasionally procured in London, second-hand. For the immediate purpose in view, it needs only be said that he proves that the body of man is filled with an aura, dynamite, fluid, vapor, influence, or whatever we may choose to call it, that it is alike in both sexes, that it is specially given off at the head, hands, and feet, that, like the aura from the magnet, it is polar, that the whole left side is positive, and imparts a sensation of warmth to a sensitive to whom we may apply our left hand, while the whole right side of the body is negative, and imparts a feeling of coolness. In some individuals this vital magnetic, or, as he calls it, odylic, force is intensely strong. Thus, we may fearlessly consider and believe any phenomenal case such as the two above quoted without fear of outstepping the limits of exact science, or of being open to the charge of superstition or credulity. It must at the same time be noted that Baron Reichenbach did not find one patient whose aura either deflected a suspended magnetic needle, or attracted iron objects like lodestone. His researches, therefore, do not cover the whole ground, and of this he was himself fully aware. Persons magnetically surcharged, like the Russian girl and the American boy, are now and then encountered, and among the class of mediums there have been a few famous ones. Thus, the medium Slade's finger, when passed either way over a compass, will attract the needle after it to any extent. The experiment was tried by Professors Zollner and W. Weber, professor of physics, founder of the doctrine of vibration of forces, at Leipzig. Professor Weber placed on the table a compass, enclosed in glass, the needle of which we could all observe very distinctly by the bright candle light, while we had our hands joined with those of Slade which were over a foot distant from the compass. So great was the magnetic aura discharging from Slade's hands, however, that after about 5 minutes the needle began to swing violently in arcs of from 40 degrees to 60 degrees till at length it several times turned completely round. At a subsequent trial, Professor Weber succeeded in having a common knitting needle, tested with the compass just before the experiment and found wholly unmagnetized, converted into a permanent magnet. Slade laid this needle upon a slate, held the latter under the table and in about 4 minutes, when the slate with the knitting needle was laid again upon the table, the needle was so strongly magnetized at one end, and only at one end, that iron shavings and sewing needle stuck to this end, the needle of the compass could be easily drawn round in a circle. The originated pole was a south pole, inasmuch as the north pole of the compass needle was attracted, the south pole repelled. Baron Reichenbach's first branch of inquiry was that of the effect of the magnet upon animal nerve, after which he proceeded to observe the effect upon the latter of a similar aura or power found by him to exist in crystals. Not to enter into details, all of which, however, should be read by everyone pretending to investigate Aryan science, his conclusion he sums up as follows: with the magnetic force, as we are acquainted with it in the lodestone and the magnetic needle, that force, odile, the new force he discovered, is associated, with which, in crystals, we have become acquainted. Hence, the force of the magnet is not, as has been hitherto taken for granted, one single force, but consists of two, since, to that long known, a new hitherto unknown, and decidedly distinct one, must be added, the force, namely, which resides in crystals. One of his patients was Emile Nautny, and her sensitiveness to the auras of the magnet and crystal was phenomenally acute. When a magnet was held near her hand, it was irresistibly attracted to follow the magnet wherever the Baron moved it. The effect upon her hand was the same as if someone had seized her hand, and by means of this drawn or bent her body towards her feet. She was lying in bed, sick, and the magnet was moved in that direction. When approached close to her hand, the hand adhered so firmly to it, that when the magnet was raised, or moved sidewards, backwards, or in any direction whatever, her hand stuck to it, as if attached in the way in which a piece of iron would have been. This, we see, is the exact reverse of the phenomenon in the American boy Collins' case, for, instead of his hand being attracted to anything, iron objects, light and heavy, seem attracted irresistibly to his hand. And only his left hand. Reichenbach naturally thought of testing Emile Nautny's magnetic condition. He says, to try this, I took filings of iron, and brought her finger over them. Not the smallest particle adhered to the finger, even when it had just been in contact with the magnet. A magnetic needle finely suspended, to the poles of which I caused her to approach her finger alternately, and in different positions, did not exhibit the slightest tendency to deviation or oscillation. Did space permit, this most interesting analysis of the accumulated facts respecting the occasional abnormal magnetic surcharge of human beings might be greatly prolonged without fatiguing the intelligent reader. But we may at once say that since Reichenbach 8 proves magnetism to be a compound instead of a simple force, and that every human being is charged with one of these forces, odile, and since the Slade experiments, and the phenomena of Russia and St. Paul, show that the human body does also at times discharge the true magnetic aura, such as is found in the lodestone, Therefore the explanation is that in these latter abnormal cases the individual has simply evolved an excess of the one instead of the other of the forces which together form what is commonly known as magnetism. There is, therefore, nothing whatever of supernatural in the cases. Why this happens is, we conceive, quite capable of explanation, but as this would take us too far afield in the less commonly known region of occult science, it had better be passed over for the present. 2 Transcendental Physics, p. 47. 3 Reichenbach, OPC id, pages 2546-210. A Psychic Warning by A. Constantine, ESQC. And any of the numerous readers of the Theosophist enlighten me as to the influence that acted on me on the occasion alluded to below. I certainly emphatically deny that there was a spirit manifestation, but there was beyond doubt some singular agency at work, which I have not up to this time been able to comprehend or explain. After having been in a certain school with another boy of about the same age as myself, we parted, and only met again after the lapse of about 35 years. It was at Agra, where he was a deputy collector and I, head clerk in the same office. Our friendship was renewed, and we soon became very much attached to each other. In fact, we had no secrets between us. Thus we continued to be for several years, and almost every day saw each other. I had occasion during the Dasara holidays to visit my brother-in-law, an opulent landholder at Meerut, and on my return related to my friend the festivities that had been observed there. My friend promised that, if he could possibly manage, he would also accompany me to my brother-in-law's at the next Dasara vacation. In the interval, and particularly when the vacation approached, we repeatedly discussed our plans, and when the time drew near we made all arrangements for fulfilling our engagement. But on the last working day in the office, when I asked my friend to meet me that evening at the appointed time at the railway station with his luggage, to my utter astonishment and disappointment he told me that he was very sorry for being unable to go with me in consequence of his family having been recommended for a change, and he was going with them to Rambach, a sanitarium on the other side of Agra. On parting he shook hands with me and again expressed his sorrow, and said that though absent in body he would be present in thought and spirit with me. On our way in the train I arranged with my wife to go to Meerut first, and after remaining 4 days there to go off to Delhi where she had never been, stop a couple of days there, and on our return to pass a day at Alur with a relation, and then to return home to Agra a day prior to the opening of my office. The program was finally settled between us. The 2 days after our arrival at my brother-in-law's were spent most pleasantly. Early on the morning of the 3rd day after partaking of some refreshments we sat together to think of amusements for the night, when all of a sudden a curious sensation came over me. I felt dull and melancholy, and told my brother-in-law that I must return to Agra immediately. He was extremely surprised. As I had agreed to spend that and the following day with him, the whole family remonstrated with me for my abrupt proposal, and naturally concluded that something or other had given me offense. But all persuasions to detain me, even for that day, proved ineffectual, and in another hour I was with my luggage on the Meerut railway station. Before we took tickets for Agra, my wife urged me to go only as far as Ghaziabad, whence the train branches off to Delhi. I did so, but no sooner was the train in motion than the longing to go to Agra again returned. Without taking any further course, I took on our arrival at Ghaziabad tickets direct for Agra. This surprised my wife very much. In fact she felt dismayed, and we sat all the way to Alur without exchanging even so much as a sentence. At Alur she was inexorable in her entreaties to see her relations. I sent her over there, but I could not be persuaded to accompany her, and proceeded to Agra, where on my arrival at night, I was thunderstruck with the dreadful news that my friend had suddenly died that very morning from apoplexy at Rambach, probably about the time I was taking refreshments at Meerut. The next morning I was present to witness the last remains of my dear friend committed to his last resting place. Every one present at the funeral, who knew that I was not to have returned to the station before the office opened, plied me with questions as to how I came to hear of the sad bereavement, and who it was that had telegraphed to me. But I candidly confess that no other communication or message was ever sent to me or even attempted save a depression in spirits, a longing and restless desire to be present at Agra as quickly as possible. Note by the editor. No need of attributing the above warning to anything supernatural. Many and varied are the psychic phenomena in life, which unintentionally or otherwise are either attributed to the agency of disembodied spirits or entirely and intentionally ignored. By saying this, we do not intend at all depriving the spiritual theory of its raison d'etre. But beside that theory there exist other manifestations of the same psychic force in man's daily life, which is generally disregarded or erroneously looked upon as a result of simple chance or coincidence, for the only reason that we are unable to forthwith assign for it a logical and comprehensive cause, though the manifestations undoubtedly bear the impress of a scientific character, evidently belonging, as they do, to that class of psychophysiological phenomena which, even men of great scientific attainments and such specialists as Drive Carpenter are now busying themselves with. The cause for this particular phenomenon is to be sought in the occult, yet no less undeniable for it, influence exercised by the active will of one man over the will of another man, whenever the will of the latter is surprised in a moment of rest or a state of passiveness. We speak now of presentiments. Were every person to pay close attention in an experimental and scientific spirit of course to his daily action and watch his thoughts, conversation, and resultant acts, and carefully analyze these, omitting no details trifling as they might appear to him, then would he find for most of these actions and thoughts coinciding reasons based upon mutual psychic influence between the embodied intelligences. Several instances, more or less familiar to everyone through personal experience, might be here adduced. We will give but two. Two friends or even simple acquaintances are separated for years. Suddenly one of them, he who remained at home and who may have never thought of the absent person for years, thinks of that individual. He remembers him without any possible cause or reason, and the long-forgotten image sweeping through the silent corridors of memory brings it before his eyes as vividly as if he were there. A few minutes after that, an hour perhaps, that absent person pays the other an unexpected visit. Another instance, A lent to B a book. B, having read and laid it aside, thinks no more of it, though A requested him to return the work immediately after perusal. Days, perhaps months after that, B's thought, occupied with important business, suddenly reverts to the book, and he remembers his neglect. Mechanically he leaves his place and stepping to his library gets it out, thinking to send it back without fail this once. At the same moment, the door opens. A enters, telling that he had come purposely to fetch his book, as he needed it. Coincidence? Not at all. In the first case, it was the fault of the traveler, which, as he had decided upon visiting an old friend or acquaintance, was concentrated upon the other man, and that thought by its very activity proved energetic enough to overpower the then passive thought of the other. The same explanation stands good in the case of A and B. But Mr. Constantine may argue, my late friend's thought could not influence mine since he was already dead, when T was being irresistibly drawn to Agra. Our answer is ready. Did not the warmest friendship exist between the writer and the deceased? Had not the latter promised to be with him in thought and spirit? And that leads to the positive inference that his thought was strongly preoccupied before his death, with him whom he had unintentionally disappointed. Sudden as may have been that death, thought is instantaneous and more rapid still. Nay, it surely was 100-fold intensified at the moment of death. Thought is the last thing that dies or rather fades out in the human brain of a dying person, and thought, as demonstrated by science, is material, since it is but a mode of energy, which itself changes form but is eternal. Hence, that thought whose strength and power are always proportionate to its intensity, became, so to say, concrete and palpable, and with the help of the strong affinity between the two, it enveloped and overpowered the whole sentient and thinking principle in Mr. Constantine, subjecting it entirely, and forcing the will of the latter to act in accordance with his desire. The thinking agent was dead and the instrument lay shattered forever. But its last sound lived, and could not have completely died out, in the waves of ether. Science says, the vibration of one single note of music will linger on in motion through the corridors of all eternity, and Theosophy, the last thought of the dying man changes into the man himself, it becomes his eidolon. Mr. Constantine would not have surprised us, nor would he have indeed deserved being accused by the skeptical of either superstition or of having labored under a hallucination had he even seen the image, or the so-called ghost of his deceased friend before him. For that ghost would have been neither the conscious spirit nor the soul of the dead man, but simply his short for one instant materialized thought projected unconsciously and by the sole power of his own intensity in the direction of him who occupied that thought. Theosophy and Spiritualism. A Calcutta correspondent asks, A. Is occultism a science akin to spiritualism? B. What are the principal points in which the Theosophists and the Spiritualists differ? C. Can a spiritualist call himself a Theosophist without altering his faith? And vice versa? D. I understand you do not believe in spiritualism then. How is it that a spiritualist has been elected president for the Bengal branch of the Theosophical Society? To which we answer, A. That Theosophy is a very ancient science, while spiritualism is a very modern manifestation of psychical phenomena. It has not yet passed the stage of experimental research. B. The difference is in our theories to account for the phenomena. We say they are mainly, though not always, due to the action of other influences than that of the disembodied conscious spirits of the dead. The spiritualists affirm the contrary. C. Yes, many excellent persons are both, and none need alter his faith. D. We do believe in the phenomena, but not as to their cause as above remarked. There being no religious or other test other than that of good moral character and sympathy with the objects of our society, applied by us to those who seek for admission, the election of the Venerable Babu Piri Chand Mitra, as president of our Bengal branch, was not only most proper, but very desirable. He is certainly the most spiritual Theosophist and most Theosophic spiritualist we have ever met. An astral prophet, a very educated Englishman, has heard the name of General Yermolov, one of the great military heroes of this age, and if at all familiar with the history of the Caucasian Wars, he must be acquainted with the exploits of one of the chief conquerors of the land of those impregnable fastnesses where Shamil and his predecessors have defied for years the skill and strategy of the Russian armies. Be it as it may, the strange event herein narrated by the Caucasian hero himself, may interest students of psychology. That which follows is a verbatim translation from V. Potto's Russian work The War in Caucasus. In Volume 2, Chapter The Period of Yermolov, pages 829, 30, 31 and 832, one reads these lines: silently and imperceptibly glided away at Moscow the last days allotted to the hero. On April the 19th, 1861, he died in his 85th year, seated in his favorite armchair, with one hand on the table, the other on his knee, but a few minutes before, in accordance with an old habit of his, he was tapping the floor with his foot. It is impossible to better express the feelings of Russia at the news of this death than by quoting the obituary notice from the Russian Daily Caucasus, which did not say a word more than was deserved. On April the 12th, at 11 a.m., at Moscow, the artillery general, famous throughout Russia Alexei Petrovich Yermolov, breathed his last. Every Russian knows the name. It is allied with the most brilliant records of our national glory. Valutino, Borodino, Culm, Paris, and the Caucasus, will be ever transmitting the name of the hero, the pride and ornament of the Russian army and nation. We will not enumerate the services of Yermolov. His name and titles are, a true son of Russia, in the full significance of the term. It is a curious fact that his death did not escape its own legend, one of a strange and mystical character. This is what a friend who knew Yermolov well, writes of him: once, when leaving Moscow, I called on Yermolov to say goodbye, and found myself unable to conceal my emotion at parting. "Fear not," he said to me, "we will yet meet, I shall not die before your return." This was 18 months before his death. "In life and death God alone is the master," I observed. "And I tell you most positively that my death will not occur in a year," but a few months later he answered, "Come with me," and with these words he led me into his study, where, getting out of a locked chest a written sheet of paper, he placed it before me, and asked, "Whose handwriting is this?" "Yours," I said. "Read it then." I complied. It was a kind of memorandum, a record of dates, since the year when Yermolov was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel, showing, as in a program, every significant event that was to happen in his life, so full of such events. He followed me in my reading, and when I was at the last paragraph, he covered the last line with his hand. "This you need not read," he added. "On this line, the year, the month, and the day, of my death are given. All that you have read was written by me beforehand, and has come to pass to the smallest details, and this is how I came to write it. When I was yet a young lieutenant colonel I was sent on some business to a small district town. My lodging consisted of 2 rooms, one for the servants, the other for my personal use. There was no access into the latter but through the former. Once, late at night, as I sat writing at my desk, I fell into a reverie, when suddenly on lifting my eyes I saw standing before me across the desk a stranger, a man, judging by his dress, belonging to the lower classes of society. Before I had time to ask him who he was or what he wanted, the stranger said, 'Take your pen and write.' Feeling myself under the influence of an irresistible power, I obeyed in silence. Then he dictated to me all that was going to happen to me during my whole life, concluding with the date and hour of my death. With the last word he vanished from the spot. A few minutes elapsed before I regained my full consciousness, when, jumping from my seat, I rushed into the adjoining room, which the stranger could not by any means avoid passing through. Opening the door, I saw my clerk writing by the light of a candle, and my orderly lying asleep on the floor across the entrance door, which door was securely locked and bolted. To my question, "Who was it who has just been here?" the astonished clerk answered, "No one." To this day I have never told this to anyone. I knew beforehand that while some would suspect me of having invented the whole thing, others would see in me a man subject to hallucinations. But for myself, personally, the whole thing is a most undeniable fact, an objective and palpable fact, the proof of which is in this very written document. The last date found on the latter proved, after the death of the general, to be the correct one. He died on the very day and hour of the year recorded in his own handwriting. Yermolov is buried at Orel. An inextinguishable lamp, made of a fragment of a bombshell, burns before his tomb. On the cast iron of the shell these words are wrought by an unskilled hand, the Caucasian soldiers who served on the Gunib. 1. The ever-burning lamp is established through the zeal and grateful love of the lower ranks of the Caucasian army, who collected among themselves from their poor pittance, kopeck by kopeck, verily, the needed sum. And this simple monument is more valued and admired than would be the richest mausoleum. There is no other monument to Yermolov in Russia. But the proud and lofty rocks of the Caucasus are the imperishable pedestal on which every true Russian will always behold the majestic image of General Yermolov, surrounded by the aureole of an everlasting and immortal glory. And now for a few words about the nature of the apparition. No doubt every word of General Yermolov's concise and clear narrative is true to a dot. He was preeminently a matter-of-fact, sincere, and clear-headed man, with not the slightest taint of mysticism about him, a true soldier, honorable, and straightforward. Moreover, this episode of his life was testified to by his elder son, known to the present writer and her family personally, for many years during our residence at Tiflis. All this is a good warrant for the genuineness of the phenomenon, testified to furthermore by one Gunib is the name of the last stronghold of the Circassians, on which the famous Murid Shamil, the priest sovereign of the mountaineers, was conquered and captured by the Russians, after years of a desperate struggle. Gonib is a gigantic rock, deemed for a long time impregnable but finally stormed and ascended by the Russian soldiers at an enormous sacrifice of life. Its capture put virtually an end to the war in the Caucasus, a struggle which had lasted for over 60 years, and assured its conquest. Ed. The written document left by the general, bearing the correct and precise date of his death. And now what about the mysterious visitor? Spiritualists will, of course, see in it a disembodied entity, a materialized spirit. It will be claimed that a human spirit alone could prophesy a whole series of events and see so clearly in futurity. So we say, too. But having agreed on that point, we diverge in all the rest, i.e., while spiritualists would say that the apparition was that of a spirit distinct from and independent of the higher ego of the general, we maintain precisely the reverse, and say it was that ego. Let us argue dispassionately. Where is the raison d'etre, the rationale of such apparition of prophecy, and why should you or I, for instance, once dead, appear to a perfect stranger for the pleasure of informing him of that which was to happen to him? Had the general recognized in the visitor some dear relative, his own father, mother, brother, or bosom friend, and received from him some beneficent warning, slight proof as it would have been, there would still be something in it to hang such theory upon. But it was nothing of the kind, simply a stranger, a man, judging by his dress, belonging to the lower classes of society. If so, why should the soul of a poor disembodied tradesman, or a laborer, trouble itself to appear to a mere stranger? And if the spirit only assumed such appearance, then why this disguise and masquerading, such post-mortem mystification, at all? If such visits are made of a spirit's free will, if such revelations can occur at the sweet pleasure of a disembodied entity, and independently of any established law of intercourse between the two worlds, what can be the reason alleged for that particular spirit playing at soothsaying Cassandra with the general? None whatever. To insist upon it, is simply to add one more absurd and repulsive feature to the theory of spirit visitation, and to throw an additional element of ridicule on the sacredness of death. The materializing of an immaterial spirit, a divine breath, by the spiritualists, is on a par with the anthropomorphizing of the absolute, by the theologians. It is these two claims which have dug an almost impassable abyss between the Theosophist occultists and the spiritualists on the one hand, and the Theosophists and the Church Christians on the other. And now this is how a Theosophist occultist would explain the vision, in accordance with esoteric philosophy. He would premise by reminding the reader that the higher consciousness in us, with its sui generis laws and conditions of manifestation, is still almost entirely terra incognita for all, spiritualists included, and the men of science preeminently. Then he would remind the reader of one of the fundamental teachings of occultism. He would say that besides the attribute of divine omniscience in its own nature and sphere of action, there exists in eternity for the individual immortal ego neither past nor future, but only one everlasting present. Now, once this doctrine is admitted, or simply postulated, it becomes only natural that the whole life, from birth to death, of the personality which that ego informs, should be as plainly visible to the higher ego as it is invisible to, and concealed from, the limited vision of its temporary and more tall form. Hence, this is what must have happened according to the occult philosophy. The friend is told by General Yermolov that while writing late in the night he had suddenly fallen into a reverie, when he suddenly perceived upon lifting the eyes a stranger standing before him. Now that reverie was most likely a sudden doze, brought on by fatigue and overwork, during which a mechanical action of purely somnambulic character took place. The personality becoming suddenly alive to the presence of its higher self, the human sleeping automaton fell under the sway of the individuality, and forthwith the hand that had been occupied with writing for several hours before resumed mechanically its task. Upon awakening, the personality thought that the document before him had been written at the dictation of a visitor whose voice he had heard, whereas, in truth, he had been simply recording the innermost thoughts, or shall we say knowledge of his own divine ego, a prophetic, because all-knowing spirit. The voice of the latter was simply the translation by the physical memory, at the instant of awakening, of the mental knowledge concerning the life of the mortal man reflected on the lower by the higher consciousness. All the other details recorded by the memory are as amenable to a natural explanation. Thus, the stranger clothed in the raiments of a poor little tradesman or laborer, who was speaking to him outside of himself, belongs, as well as the voice, to that class of well-known phenomena familiar to us as the association of ideas and reminiscences in our dreams. The pictures and scenes we see in sleep. The events we live through for hours, days, sometimes for years in our dreams, all this takes less time, in reality, than is occupied by a flash of lightning during the instant of awakening and the return to full consciousness. Of such instances of the power and rapidity of fancy physiology gives numerous examples. We rebel against the materialistic deductions of modern science, but no one can controvert its facts, patiently and carefully recorded throughout long years of experiments and observations by its specialists, and these support our argument. General Yermolov had passed several days previously holding an inquest in a small town, in which official business he had probably examined dozens of men of the poorer classes, and this explains his fancy vivid as reality itself, suggesting to his imagination the vision of a small tradesman. Let us turn to the experiences and explanations of a long series of philosophers and initiates, thoroughly acquainted with the mysteries of the inner self, before we father upon departed spirits' actions, motives for which could never be explained upon any reasonable grounds. H.P.B. Memory in the Dying. We find in a very old letter from a master, written years ago to a member of the Theosophical Society, the following suggestive lines on the mental state of a dying man: at the last moment, the whole life is reflected in our memory and emerges from all the forgotten nooks and corners, picture after picture, one event after the other. The dying brain dislodges memory with a strong, supreme impulse, and memory restores faithfully every impression that has been entrusted to it during the period of the brain's activity. That impression and thought which was the strongest, naturally becomes the most vivid, and survives, so to say, all the rest, which now vanish and disappear forever, but to reappear in Devachan. No man dies insane or unconscious, as some physiologists assert. Even a madman or one in a fit of delirium tremens will have his instant of perfect lucidity at the moment of death, though unable to say so to those present. The man may often appear dead. Yet from the last pulsation, and between the last throbbing of his heart and the moment when the last spark of animal heat leaves the body, the brain thinks and the ego lives, in these few brief seconds, his whole life over again. Speak in whispers, ye who assist at a deathbed and find yourselves in the solemn presence of death. Especially have ye to keep quiet just after death has laid her clammy hand upon the body. Speak in whispers, one say, lest you disturb the quiet ripple of thought and hinder the busy work of the past casting its reflection upon the veil of the future. The above statement has been more than once strenuously opposed by materialists. Biology and scientific psychology, it was urged, were both against the idea, and while the latter had no well-demonstrated data to go upon in such a hypothesis, the former dismissed the idea as an empty superstition. Meanwhile, even biology is bound to progress, and this is what we learn of its latest achievements. Dr. Fair has communicated quite recently to the Biological Society of Paris a very curious note on the mental state of the dying, which corroborates marvelously the above lines. For, it is to the special phenomenon of life reminiscences, and that sudden re-emerging on the blank walls of memory, from all its long neglected and forgotten nooks and corners, of picture after picture, that Dr. Fair draws the special attention of biologists. We need notice but two among the numerous instances given by the scientist in his rapport, to show how scientifically correct are the teachings we receive from our Eastern masters. The first instance is that of a moribund consumptive whose disease was developed in consequence of a spinal affection. Already consciousness had left the man, when, recalled to life by 2 successive injections of a gram of ether, the patient slightly lifted his head and began talking rapidly in Flemish, a language no one around him, nor yet himself, understood. Offered a pencil and a piece of white cardboard, he wrote with great rapidity several lines in that language very correctly, as was ascertained later on, fell back, and died. When translated, the writing was found to refer to a very prosaic affair. He had suddenly recollected, he wrote, that he owed a certain man a sum of 15 francs since 1868, hence more than 20 years, and desired it to be paid. But why write his last wish in Flemish? The defunct was a native of Antwerp, but had left his country in childhood, without ever knowing the language, and having passed all his life in Paris, could speak and write only in French. Evidently his returning consciousness, that last flash of memory that displayed before him, as in a retrospective panorama, all his life, even to the trifling fact of his having borrowed 20 years back a few francs from a friend, did not emanate from his physical brain alone, but rather from his spiritual memory, that of the higher ego, manas, or the reincarnating individuality. The fact of his speaking and writing Flemish, a language that he had heard at a time of life when he could not yet speak himself, is an additional proof. The ego is almost omniscient in its immortal nature. For indeed matter is nothing more than the last degree and as the shadow of existence, as Ravizon, member of the French Institute, tells us. But to our second case. Another patient, dying of pulmonary consumption and likewise reanimated by an injection of ether, turned his head towards his wife and rapidly said to her, "You cannot find that pin now, all the floor has been renewed since then." This was in reference to the loss of a scarf pin 18 years before, a fact so trifling that it had almost been forgotten, but which had not failed to be revived. In the last thought of the dying man, who having expressed what he saw in words, suddenly stopped and breathed his last. Thus any one of the 1,000 little daily events, and accidents of a long life would seem capable of being recalled to the flickering consciousness, at the supreme moment of dissolution. A long life, perhaps, lived over again in the space of one short second. A third case may be noticed, which corroborates still more strongly that assertion of occultism which traces all such remembrances to the thought power of the individual, instead of to that of the personal, lower, ego. A young girl, who had been a sleepwalker up to her 22nd year, performed during her hours of somnambulic sleep the most varied functions of domestic life, of which she had no remembrance upon awakening. Among other psychic impulses that manifested themselves only during her sleep, was a secretive tendency quite alien to her waking state. During the latter she was open and frank to a degree, and very careless of her personal property, but in the somnambulic state she would take articles belonging to herself or within her reach and hide them away with ingenious cunning. This habit being known to her friends and relatives, and 2 nurses, having been in attendance to watch her actions during her night rambles for years, nothing disappeared but what could be easily restored to its usual place. But on one sultry night, the nurse falling asleep, the young girl got up and went to her father's study. The latter, a notary of fame, had been working till a late hour that night. It was during a momentary absence from his room that the somnambule entered, and deliberately possessed herself of a will left open upon the desk, as also of a sum of several £1,000s in bonds and notes. These she proceeded to hide in the hollow of 2 dummy pillars set up in the library to match the solid ones, and stealing from the room before her father's return, she regained her chamber and bed without awakening the nurse who was still asleep in the armchair. The result was, that, as the nurse stoutly denied that her young mistress had left the room, suspicion was diverted from the real culprit and the money could not be recovered. The loss of the will involved a lawsuit which almost beggared her father and entirely ruined his reputation, and the family were reduced to great straits. About 9 years later the young girl who, during the previous 7 years had not been somnambulic, fell into a consumption of which she ultimately died. Upon her deathbed, the veil which had hung before her physical memory was raised, her divine insight awakened, the pictures of her life came streaming back before her inner eye, and among others she saw the scene of her somnambulic robbery. Suddenly arousing herself from the lethargy in which she had lain for several hours, her face showed signs of some terrible emotion working within, and she cried out, "Ah, what have I done? It was I who took the wool and the money. Go search the dummy pillars in the library, I have." She never finished her sentence, for her very emotion killed her. But the search was made and the wool and money found within the oaken pillars as she had said. What makes the case more strange is, that these pillars were so high, that even by standing upon a chair and with plenty of time at her disposal instead of only a few moments, the somnambulist could not have reached up and dropped the objects into the hollow columns. It is to be noted, however, that ecstatics and convulsionists, vide the convulsionnaires de Saint-Macdard et de Morizine, seem to possess an abnormal facility for climbing blank walls and leaping even to the tops of trees. Taking the facts as stated, would they not induce one to believe that the somnambulic personage possesses an intelligence and memory of its own apart from the physical memory of the waking lower self, and that it is the former which remembers in articulo mortis the body and physical senses, in the latter case ceasing to function, and the intelligence gradually making its final escape through the avenue of psychic, and last of all of spiritual consciousness? And why not? Even materialistic science begins now to concede to psychology more than one fact that would have vainly begged of it recognition 20 years ago. The real existence, Ravizon tells us, the life of which every other life is but an imperfect outline, a faint sketch, is that of the soul. That which the public in general calls soul, we speak of as the reincarnating ego. To be, is to live, and to live is to will and think, says the French scientist. 1. But, if indeed the physical brain is of only a limited area, the field for the containment of rapid flashes of unlimited and infinite thought, neither will nor thought can be said to be generated within it, even according to materialistic science, the impassable chasm between matter and mind having been confessed both by Tyndall and many others. The fact is that the human brain is simply the canal between two planes, the psycho-spiritual and the mate1 rapport sur la philosophique en France au XIXme siècle real, through which every abstract and metaphysical idea filters from the monastic down to the lower human consciousness. Therefore, the ideas about the infinite and the absolute are not, nor can they be, within our brain capacities. They can be faithfully mirrored only by our spiritual consciousness, thence to be more or less faintly projected onto the tables of our perceptions on this plane. Thus, while the records of even important events are often obliterated from our memory, not the most trifling action of our lives can disappear from the soul's memory, because it is no memory for it, but an ever-present reality on the plane which lies outside our conceptions of space and time. Man is the measure of all things, said Aristotle, and surely he did not mean by man, the form of flesh, bones and muscles. Of all the deep thinkers, Edgar Quinet, the author of Creation, expressed this idea the best. Speaking of man, full of feelings and thoughts of which he has either no consciousness at all, or which he feels only as dim and hazy impressions, he shows that man realizes quite a small portion only of his moral being. The thoughts we think, but are unable to define and formulate, once repelled, seek refuge in the very root of our being. When chased by the persistent efforts of our will, they retreat before it, still further, still deeper into who knows what fibers, but wherein they remain to reign and impress us unbidden and unknown to ourselves. Yes, they become as imperceptible and as unreachable as the vibrations of sound and color when these surpass the normal range. Unseen and eluding grasp, they yet work, and thus lay the foundations of our future actions and thoughts, and obtain mastery over us, though we may never think of them and are often ignorant of their very being and presence. Nowhere does Quinet, the great student of nature, seem more right in his observations than when speaking of the mysteries with which we are all surrounded, the mysteries of neither earth nor heaven but those present in the marrow of our bones, in our brain cells, our nerves and fibers. No need, he adds, in order to search for the unknown, to lose ourselves in the realm of the stars, when here, near us and in us, rests the unreachable. As our world is mostly formed of imperceptible beings which are the real constructors of its continents, so likewise is man. Verily so, since man is a bundle of obscure, and to himself conscious perceptions, of indefinite feelings and misunderstood emotions, of ever-forgotten memories and knowledge that becomes on the surface of his plain ignorance. Yet, while physical memory in a healthy living man is often obscured, one fact crowding out another weaker one, at the moment of the great change that man calls death, that which we call memory seems to return to us in all its vigor and freshness. May this not be due, as just said, simply to the fact that, for a few seconds at least, our two memories, or rather the two states, the highest and the lowest state, of consciousness, blend together, thus forming one, and that the dying being finds himself on a plane wherein there is neither past nor future, but all is one present? Memory, as we all know, is strongest with regard to its early associations, then when the future man is only a child, and more of a soul than of a body, and if memory is a part of our soul, then, as Thackeray has somewhere said, it must be of necessity eternal. Scientists deny this, we, Theosophists, affirm that it is so. They have for what they hold but negative proofs, we have, to support us, innumerable facts of the kind just instanced, in the three cases described by us. The links of the chain of cause and effect with relation to mind are, and must ever remain, a terra incognita to the materialist. For if they have already acquired a deep conviction that, as Pope says, lulled in the countless chambers of the brain our thoughts are linked by many a hidden chain, and that they are still unable to discover these chains, how can they hope to unravel the mysteries of the higher, spiritual, mind? H.P. B. Greek type not being available, the Greek words have been omitted. Theosophical Literature Isis Unveiled, a Master Key to the Mysteries of Ancient and Modern Science and Theology by H.P. Blavatsky Vol. I Science, XLV plus 628 pages. Vol. 2 Theology, 4 plus 640 pp. This exhaustive study of religion and science was Madame Blavatsky's first presentation of theosophy to the modern world. It is reproduced in photographic facsimile of the original edition, 1877, 2 volumes bound in one, cloth, complete with general index and supplementary topical index. American edition The Secret Doctrine, The Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy by H.P. Blavatsky Vol. I Cosmogenesis, Slay I plus 676 pages. Volume U Anthropogenesis, 14 plus 798 pages. A systematic development of theosophical teachings on cosmogenesis, anthropogenesis, symbolism, comparative religion, with extensive comparisons of ancient wisdom with scientific conceptions. Facsimile of original, 1888, edition, 2 volumes bound in one, cloth, complete with index, XXXPP. American edition index to The Secret Doctrine, a volume and page reference to the original edition, London 1888, and to the photographic facsimile reproduction, listed above. Reprint X plus 172 pages. American edition The Key to Theosophy, an exposition, in question and answer, of the ethics, science, and philosophy of theosophy by H. P. Blavatsky. Reprint of original edition, 1889, 15 plus 36 7 pages. Indian edition The Voice of the Silence, by H. P. Blavatsky. A blank verse rendition of chosen fragments from the Book of the Golden Precepts, belonging to the Contemplative or Mahayana, Yogacarya, school. Reprint of the original edition, 1889, 4 plus 79 pages, cloth. Indian edition Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, by H. P. Blavatsky. Reprint of the original, 1923, XXIV plus 149 pages, cloth. American edition A Modern Panarayan, by H. P. Blavatsky. A collection of fugitive fragments. American edition The Ocean of Theosophy by William Q. Judge. A comprehensive text on the theosophical philosophy by a co-founder of the theosophical movement, widely used as a text in study classes. Reprint of original edition, 1893, 15 plus 182 pages. Indian edition The Bhagavad Gita, rendered into English by William Q. Judge, an ancient dialogue of philosophical religion from the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, cloth, 18 plus 133 pages. Indian edition Notes on the Bhagavad Gita by W. Q. Judge. Indian edition Letters That Have Helped Me by W. Q. Judge. American edition, and shorter Indian edition The Friendly Philosopher, compiled from Letters and Talks by Robert Crosby, 415 pages, cloth. American edition Universal Theosophy by Robert Crosby, Indian edition 5 Years of Theosophy. Essay selected from the Theosophist. American edition Order from Theosophy Company, Mysore, Private Limited, 4, Sir Krishna Rao Road, Bangalore 560,004, India.